bleeding, leeches, and prayers. Medieval medicine is often remembered as a gruesome cocktail of ignorance and superstition. But what if the real story is far more complex? What if behind the horror stories and bizarre rituals was a world desperately trying to understand the human body with the tools it had? This is not just a story about failed cures. It's about fear, faith, survival, and the brutal truth of what healing looked like before science took hold. Filth was not a flaw of medieval life. It was a feature. In most European cities, human and animal waste flowed freely through the streets. Rotten food, slaughterhouse runoff, and standing water collected in gutters that rarely drained. People walked through it daily, their boots coated in grime that never fully dried. There was no concept of bacteria or infection, only the heavy smell of decay and the frequent appearance of death. Across Europe, sickness was everywhere. Fevers, coughing, boils, and wasting illnesses struck without warning or explanation. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, and death was not confined to the old. Children died routinely, women vanished during childbirth, and even minor wounds could turn fatal. Medicine, in the modern sense, didn't exist. What did exist was a patchwork of guesses, traditions, and beliefs rooted in theology, astrology, and ancient theory. Illness was rarely seen as something physical. To most, it was punishment, divine retribution for sin, either personal or collective. If a man suffered from seizures, it wasn't an issue of the nervous system, it was possession. If a woman wasted away with fever, perhaps her soul was tainted. The body was not understood as a machine that could malfunction. It was a spiritual vessel that could be corrupted. This thinking led to treatments, designed more for moral purification than medical relief. A priest's blessing was sometimes valued more than any herbal cure. People fasted, bled themselves, applied holy relics to their skin, or wore amulets to fend off invisible spirits. Astrology-guided diagnoses, the position of Mars or Saturn, could be blamed for a bout of dysentery. An eclipse was a warning of coming plague. The lack of understanding did not mean a lack of effort. People tried to help each other with what little they had. Mothers chewed herbs and applied them to their children's wounds. Elders handed down folk remedies that occasionally worked by accident, but there was no systematic knowledge. Controlled experiments, just hope, repetition, and desperation in the wealthiest cities. The nobility could afford rare treatments imported from the East or prescriptions based on Galenic texts. But for the poor, survival came down to endurance. And luck. A tooth infection could kill. A broken leg might lead to amputation with no anesthesia. And there were no guarantees. A clean, pious life offered no real protection. The plague took sinners and saints alike. This constant proximity to death shaped medieval culture. Art was filled with reminders of mortality, the Danse Macabre. Skulls and grave imagery were not stylistic flourishes, but reflections of daily experience. Healing was never just about the body. It was about saving the soul before the inevitable. For over 1,000 years, nearly every illness in Europe was explained by one idea, the theory of the four humours. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. These fluids, ancient physicians claimed, governed not only health, but mood, behavior, and fate. The theory was not medieval in origin. It began in the 5th century BCE with Hippocrates, and was expanded by Galen of Pergamon in the 2nd century CE, whose writings shaped European medicine well into the 1600s. In this framework, disease was not caused by external agents. It was caused by imbalance. Too much black bile, and the body would fall into melancholy. Too much blood, and the result might be fever, mania, or even stroke. Each humor was tied to one of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. They were also tied to seasons, temperaments, and organs. Diagnosis became a matter of interpretation, of color, odor, excretion, or complexion. A patient coughing up yellow mucus might be classified as choleric, ruled by fire and bile, and prescribed cold, moist foods to restore balance. A sluggish man with pale skin might be labeled phlegmatic and treated with heat and purgatives. Bloodletting was common, used not just for fever, but for headaches, rashes, or emotional instability. Physicians used leeches, knives, or cupping to remove what they believed was excess. Entire books were written to guide doctors on which vein to cut, on which day, under which moon. This approach, though deeply flawed, offered structure. In a time without microscopes or germ theory, it gave physicians a framework, a way to reason through disease. Treatments were not always random. They followed principles, often wrong, but logically applied. And for many, that logic was comforting. Galen's influence was immense. His texts were translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, then reintroduced to Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries. Universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford taught Galenic medicine as dogma. To question it was to challenge centuries of accepted truth. Even as autopsies revealed inconsistencies, the theory endured. Medical students were still taught humoral theory well into the Renaissance. The psychological side of the theory was also taken seriously. People were believed to have dominant humors that shaped their personality. Sanguine individuals, rich in blood, were cheerful and social. Melancholic people, dominated by black bile, were introspective or depressive. This blend of medicine and character study influenced literature, law, and even hiring decisions. Health and identity were inseparable, but the system had limits. It failed to explain contagion. It offered no protection against the plague, and its reliance on balance meant that recovery often came by chance, not treatment. Bleeding a patient, already weakened by fever, could accelerate death, not prevent it. Yet the theory persisted, not because it worked, but because it made sense in a world that didn't, single quotes, to the dominance of humoral medicine. Shows how fragile truth can be when built on untested ideas. It reveals how long a system can survive, not through results, but through tradition, authority, and the absence of alternatives. In medieval Europe, being sick meant navigating a maze of healers, each with different methods, beliefs, and levels of training. There was no unified medical profession. Instead, the sick turned to whoever was available, affordable, and, often, least dangerous. At the top of the hierarchy were university-trained physicians. Educated at institutions like the University of Paris or Bologna, they studied ancient texts, mostly Galen and Hippocrates, and rarely saw patients directly. Instead, they diagnosed based on appearance, urine samples, and astrological charts. Their remedies were expensive, their Latin incomprehensible to most patients, and their role largely confined to advising the wealthy. For everyone else, healing came from the hands of those with practical skills: barber surgeons, monks, midwives, and apothecaries. Barber surgeons, often trained through apprenticeships rather than books, performed the bloodletting, tooth-pulling, and amputations that physicians avoided. Their tools were crude, Sterilization was unknown, and pain relief was limited to alcohol or prayers. They doubled as barbers, and their striped red and white pole, a symbol still seen today, came from bloodied bandages once hung outside to dry. Monks and nuns provided care in monastic infirmaries. These religious institutions were some of the only places that offered organized shelter for the sick, especially the poor. Benedictine monasteries maintained herb gardens and compiled medical texts, some translated from Arabic. Monks treated patients with poultices, broths, and prayers, believing that care of the sick was part of Christian duty. However, their treatments were still tied to religious interpretation, often prioritizing confession and last rites over medical intervention. Midwives handled childbirth, miscarriages, and female ailments. Their knowledge passed orally from one generation to the next, though often trusted in their communities. Midwives were also vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, especially when births went wrong or herbs proved too effective. In some regions, they faced increasing scrutiny from both the church and emerging male-dominated medical guilds. Apothecaries served as the chemists of the time. They prepared remedies using herbs, minerals, and animal products, guided by both written recipes and folk tradition. Their shops were stocked with imported spices, powdered roots, and preserved organs. Some apothecaries worked closely with physicians. Others served communities directly. The quality and accuracy of their remedies varied widely. Beyond these, more established roles were countless folk healers, herbalists, and wandering quacks. Some traveled from village to village, selling miracle cures, snake oil equivalents of the medieval era. Others genuinely believed in their craft, drawing on regional traditions, pagan rituals, or personal experience. Without regulation, anyone could claim to be a healer, which meant treatments ranged from helpful to harmful. Access to care was shaped by status. Nobles could summon educated physicians. Urban merchants might afford barber surgeons or apothecaries. Peasants relied on midwives, monks, or whoever they could find. There was no universal system, no guarantee of relief. Medicine was fragmented, and desperation was common. The medieval world did not lack caregivers. It lacked consistency, scientific method, and accountability. Healing was improvised, a blend of ritual, guesswork, tradition, and faith, shaped by who you were, where you lived, and how much you could pay. In medieval Europe, the word hospital meant something very different from what it means today. These were not institutions of healing. They were shelters, places of last resort for the poor, the abandoned, and the dying. Many were run by religious orders, built beside monasteries, cathedrals, or pilgrimage routes. Their purpose was not to cure, but to offer spiritual comfort and prepare souls for death. Sanitation was not a concern. Patients shared beds, sometimes 2 or 3 to a mattress. Lice, fleas, and infected wounds spread unchecked. There was no knowledge of contagion. Clean water was limited. Ventilation was poor. Human waste was collected in buckets, emptied sporadically, and often dumped into open ditches. In many hospitals, the sick lay in the same room where food was prepared, prayers were held, and visitors passed freely. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century and rebuilt in the 12th, is one of the best documented examples. By the 14th century, it held hundreds of patients at once, often far beyond its intended capacity. Rows of narrow beds lined vast stone halls, sometimes so crowded that dying patients were placed between the feet of those already occupying beds. There are records from the 15th century noting that between 6 to 18 patients could be crammed into a single bed during peak plagues or harsh winters. Treatment, if any, was basic. Care consisted of broths, herbal concoctions, and prayers. Nurses were usually nuns, trained not in medicine, but in scripture and service. Physicians rarely visited hospitals. Instead, these institutions served a religious function to show Christian charity, provide a place to die in grace, and reduce the suffering of the poor. Many hospitals were named after saints. Their chapels were more developed than their wards. The last rites were administered more frequently than bandages. Hospitals also admitted the elderly, orphans, the mentally ill, and travelers, often indistinguishably. The term hospitalis referred to hospitality, not health. The boundary between shelter, hospice, and asylum was blurred. In 13th century England, hospitals like St. Bartholomew's in London or St. Mary's in Chichester operated more like almshouses. They offered routine shelter to the destitute, regardless of diagnosis or prognosis. There were exceptions. Some hospitals attempted rudimentary surgeries or segregated patients with visible illnesses. Leper houses, known as lazarettos, existed outside city walls, often surrounded by superstition and fear. But overall, the idea of recovery was secondary. Survival, when it occurred, was credited to divine mercy, not to care or treatment. By modern standards, medieval hospitals resemble crowded hospices more than clinics. Their value lay in their intent to offer dignity through death, charity through care, and religious solace in the final days. But they were ill-equipped for healing. In the eyes of many who entered, they were not places to get better. They were places to wait for the end. In 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships arrived in the port of Messina, Sicily. What they carried would alter the course of European history. Aboard were sailors writhing in fever, their bodies covered in dark boils, oozing blood and pus. Within weeks, the disease had spread to the Italian mainland. Within months it had moved across France, Spain, and England. By the end of 1351, it had claimed the lives of an estimated 25 to 50 million people, nearly 1/3 of Europe's population. The Black Death was not the first epidemic, but its scale shattered the fragile confidence medieval society had. In its understanding of the world, the physicians of the time had no tools to stop it. The dominant medical theory, based on humoral imbalance, offered no explanation for mass death that ignored social class, piety, or physical condition. Some believed the plague was caused by bad air or miasma, released by earthquakes or planetary alignments. Others saw it as divine punishment for humanity's sins. In both cases, the response was the same: fear, confusion, and frantic, often irrational attempts at prevention. Communities burned aromatic herbs to purify the air. Streets were filled with the scent of lavender, rosemary, and juniper. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with perfumed cloth to ward off invisible toxins. These so-called plague doctors, now iconic, rarely cured anyone. Most treatments failed or made matters worse. Bloodletting was still widely practiced, weakening the body further. Pustules were cut open and cauterized with hot irons. People smeared themselves with mercury or bathed in vinegar. Nothing worked. In some areas, panic turned violent. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg, hundreds of Jews were rounded up and burned alive in 1349. A mass killing sparked by hysteria, not evidence. The scapegoating was widespread, fueled by fear and encouraged by local authorities. When reason collapsed, it left space for brutality. The psychological toll was just as devastating as the physical. Entire villages vanished, fields went unharvested, priests, doctors, and nobles fled cities, abandoning their roles. Some towns reported death rates so high that bodies were buried in mass graves without prayers. The social order cracked under the weight of loss. Among the most extreme reactions were the flagellant bands of men who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public processions, begging for forgiveness on behalf of humanity. They believed the plague was God's judgment and that only public suffering could end it. In 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the movement, fearing its growing influence and its tendency to incite chaos. The trauma of the plague reshaped how people thought about life, death, and the limits of knowledge. For some, it deepened religious faith. For others, it sparked quiet disillusionment. Confidence in the old medical texts eroded. If Galen and Hippocrates had no answers, perhaps their authority deserved to be questioned. In the decades that followed, subtle changes began to emerge. Cities introduced quarantine measures. Venice established one of the first lazaretto's isolation hospitals on nearby islands. The word 40, meaning 40 days, reflected the new idea that controlling movement could save lives, though imperfect. These responses marked a shift away from superstition toward organized public health. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It exposed the fragility of medieval medicine and belief. Under pressure, old systems cracked, and though new ones would take centuries to form, the trauma of the plague made it harder to return to the blind trust that once defined the age. In the medieval world, surgery was a last resort. It was brutal, excruciating, and often fatal, not because of incompetence, but because pain itself was an unmanageable enemy. Anesthesia, as we understand it today, didn't exist. Alcohol might dull the senses. A blow to the head might knock someone unconscious. But for most, surgery meant full awareness, full pain, and the very real risk of dying from shock or infection before the wound could even close. The tools were functional but unforgiving. Bone saws, iron hooks, cautery irons, heated over open flames. Bleeding was not only expected, it was part of the treatment. Patients were restrained by assistants or tied down with ropes. Screams were common. Passing out from the pain was a best-case outcome. Recovery, if it came, often involved infection, fever, or gangrene. Antibiotics were centuries away, and sterilization was unheard of. Surgeons reused their tools without cleaning, wiping blades on aprons already soaked in blood. Amputations were the most common form of major surgery. Arms and legs crushed in battle, infected by disease, or mangled in accidents, had to be removed quickly to prevent death. The operation was performed as fast as possible. A skilled surgeon could remove a limb in under 2 minutes. The stump was then sealed with a hot iron, a process called cauterization, to stop bleeding and, in theory, prevent infection. It often didn't. Military campaigns became a crucible for surgical practice. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, battlefield injuries forced rapid innovation. Surgeons working on the front lines learned to operate under pressure, to improvise, and, occasionally, to document their techniques. Guy de Charliac, a 14th-century French physician who served during the Black Death, wrote Chirurgia Magna, a surgical manual that became a reference across Europe. He advised against surgery unless absolutely necessary. describing it as an act of desperation, not of healing, trepanation. The drilling or cutting of a hole into the skull was another grim procedure still practiced in parts of medieval Europe. It was used to treat head trauma, seizures, or mental disorders believed to be caused by pressure or spirits. Archaeological evidence shows that some patients survived these operations, with bone regrowth indicating healing. But the risks were immense, and the rationale was rarely medical by modern standards. Barber surgeons, distinct from university-trained physicians, performed most of these operations. Their training came through apprenticeship, not academic study. They were craftsmen, not scholars. Yet they held the blade, and their work saved lives, even as it ended others. Survival often depended on luck, personal constitution, and the environment. Wounds treated in rural areas sometimes fared better than those in urban hospitals, simply because they weren't exposed to as many pathogens. But overall, surgery was dangerous, a terrifying calculation of risk over certainty, pain over probability. The story of medieval surgery is not just one of suffering. It's a record of human endurance and the beginnings of anatomical understanding. Developed in blood-soaked rooms and on smoky battlefields, long before medicine became a science. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church stood not just as a spiritual authority, but as the gatekeeper of knowledge. Its influence extended into every major institution, including medicine. Healing the body was acceptable, but questioning the divine order was not. And for centuries, studying the human body in any physical sense risked being labeled heretical. Anatomy, in practice, was not studied through direct observation. It was read. Galen, a Greek physician who lived in the Roman Empire during the 2nd century CE, became the unquestioned source for anatomical knowledge. His texts described the structure of the human body in detail, but they were based on animal dissections, primarily pigs and monkeys. Still, for over 1,000 years, they were accepted without challenge across Europe, copied and taught in universities sanctioned by the Church. The Church did not outright ban all study of medicine. In fact, many hospitals were church-run, and monks preserved ancient texts through meticulous transcription. But physical dissection of the human body was tightly restricted, both by religious taboo and legal policy. By the 13th century, the Council of Tours in 1163 had declared Ecclesia abhorret, a sanguine, the Church abhors blood. By the 1299 papal bull De Sepulturis, dismemberment of corpses for transport or study was condemned. While the wording was ambiguous and varied by region, the effect was chilling. Anatomical research stalled. Observation was replaced with mem horization.2. Question established texts was not just academic dissent, it was seen as moral deviation. Those who pushed for direct anatomical investigation risked excommunication or worse. Physicians who disagreed with Galenic doctrine had to tread carefully, often disguising empirical findings in the language of tradition or faith. But resistance did exist in Bologna. The Italian anatomist Mondino de Luzzi performed one of the first public human dissections around 1315. His work, Anatothomia, became a foundational text, blending classical references with first-hand observation. Though still heavily reliant on Galen, Mondino represented a turning point, the slow return to the body itself as a source of knowledge. In the early 14th century, Ibn al-Nafis, a physician in the Islamic world, correctly described pulmonary circulation, how blood moves from the heart to the lungs and back. His findings contradicted Galen's model but were ignored in Europe for centuries, partly due to religious and cultural isolation. Later, Andreas Vesalius would lead a more direct challenge. Born in 1514 in what is now Belgium, Vesalius studied medicine at the University of Padua and began conducting his own dissections. In 1543, he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. The book exposed dozens of errors in Galen's work. It was revolutionary and controversial. Vesalius faced intense criticism, not just from religious leaders, but from academic institutions loyal to tradition. Despite this, his work laid the foundation for modern anatomy. The Church's control over science was not absolute, but it was powerful. Its grip slowed the pace of medical discovery for centuries, turning curiosity into risk. In this environment, every incision, every deviation from doctrine was an act of defiance, and the body, once seen only as a vessel for the soul, became, slowly, a source of truth. While much of medieval Europe clung to outdated texts and banned anatomical study, the Islamic world became a center of medical progress. From the 8th to the 13th century, under the Abbasid Caliphate and beyond, scholars across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Spain preserved, translated, and expanded upon the medical works of Greece, Persia, and India. The result was not just preservation, it was transformation in Baghdad. The House of Wisdom Beit al-Hikmah stood as a major intellectual hub by the 9th century. It was here that Greek texts, including the writings of Galen and Hippocrates, were translated into Arabic. But this wasn't mere copying. Scholars such as Al-Razi, known in the West as Razors, critically analyzed the material and introduced new observations based on clinical experience. Al-Razi, born in 865 in what is now Iran, was one of the earliest physicians to separate medicine from religion in his practice. He ran hospitals, wrote extensively, and described diseases like smallpox and measles in detail. His Kitab al-Hawi, the comprehensive book on medicine, was one of the most complete medical texts of its time, and later translated into Latin in the 12th century. Then came Ibn Sina, Avicenna, born in 980 in Bukhara. His Canon of Medicine would become the most influential medical text in both the Islamic world and Europe for over 5 centuries, drawing on Greek sources but organizing them into a clear, systematic framework. Avicenna included observations on infectious disease, pharmacology, and even the importance of hygiene. His emphasis on evidence, observation, and cause and effect set him apart from the more rigid, scholastic traditions in Europe. Medical institutions in the Islamic world were also more advanced. Hospitals like the one in Cairo, established in the 9th century, offered separate wards for different diseases, employed full-time physicians, and maintained detailed patient records. Treatment was based not just on tradition, but on what worked. Meanwhile, in Europe, much of this knowledge remained out of reach. Political instability, religious censorship, and linguistic barriers created a knowledge gap. Latin-speaking scholars had little access to Arabic texts until the 12th century translation movement began in places like Toledo and Salerno. From there, Latin translations of Avicenna, Al-Razi, and others began circulating in Europe, often without full acknowledgement of their origins. These translations had a profound impact. European universities slowly began incorporating Arabic-based medical knowledge, but by then, the Islamic world had been refining those ideas for centuries. The delay left Europe far behind in medical theory and practice. This divergence highlights how the course of medicine was shaped not just by ideas, but by culture, politics, and power. While one half of the world pushed boundaries, the other preserved its traditions, until it was forced to catch up. By the late 15th century, the cracks in medieval medical tradition were no longer subtle. The same texts that had once been treated as sacred works by Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna were now being questioned. Slowly, method replaced memory. Observation began to compete with reverence. The transition wasn't sudden, but it was irreversible. The printing press, introduced to Europe by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, changed the flow of knowledge. Before, a single medical manuscript took months to copy by hand. Now, books could be produced in hundreds, then thousands. By the early 16th century, medical texts were circulating more widely than ever before, just among scholars, but among students, practitioners, and critics. Among those critics was Andreas Vesalius, born in 1514, trained at the University of Paris and later Padua. Vesalius took the bold step of dissecting human bodies himself. In 1543, he published the Humani Corporis Fabrica, detailed, illustrated anatomy based on real dissections, not inherited assumptions. The book exposed numerous errors in Galen's work. Galen had never dissected a human body. Vesalius had dissected hundreds. He found that the human jaw was a single bone, not two, that the sternum had 3 parts, not 7, that the heart structure did not match classical descriptions. These discoveries did not go unchallenged. Vesalius was attacked by conservative scholars. Some accused him of arrogance, others of blasphemy. But the precedent was set. Observation could override authority. Anatomy was no longer just commentary, it was evidence. Around the same time, thinkers like Paracelsus rejected the four-humor theory entirely. Born in 1493, Paracelsus argued that illness came from external agents, not internal imbalances. He introduced the use of chemicals in treatment and insisted on direct experience over scholastic theory, though many of his ideas were erratic or untested. His approach reflected a shift in mindset from tradition to experimentation. Universities began adjusting their curricula. Dissections became more frequent. Hospitals started to track patients and procedures. Public health measures, such as quarantine and urban sanitation, were adopted not just during plagues, but as preventative strategies. In cities like Venice and Milan, record-keeping improved. Disease was no longer seen only as divine punishment, but as a problem with identifiable causes and potential solutions. What had begun as crude guesswork was now evolving into a method. Trial and error, empirical testing, and direct observation replaced ritual and repetition. The horrors of medieval medicine, the bleeding, the ignorance, the dogma left a lasting scar, but also a lesson. Pain, death, and failure had exposed the limits of belief and opened the door to inquiry. By the early 1600s, the scientific revolution was gaining momentum. Medicine would still have a long road ahead, but the foundations were shifting. What followed was not just a change in knowledge, but in how knowledge was created, and that shift began with the unraveling of certainty. Medieval medicine is often dismissed as backward, irrational, and superstitious, a chaotic era where bloodletting passed for science and leeches replaced reason. But that image, shaped by modern hindsight and centuries of ridicule, obscures the complexity of how people once understood the body, illness, and healing. Not all practices were failures. Herbal remedies, some passed down through generations, contained real pharmacological value. Willow bark, used to treat pain and fever, contains salicin, the chemical precursor to aspirin. Honey, applied to wounds, acted as an antibacterial agent. Mandrake and opium were used in small doses to dull pain. These treatments weren't based on germ theory or cellular biology, but they often worked, even if no one knew why. The boundary between magic and medicine was never clearly drawn. A charm worn around the neck, a prayer whispered over a fevered child, or a poultice of herbs soaked in wine might all be part of the same treatment. Healing was as much about belief and ritual as it was about ingredients. In a world without microscopes, faith filled the gap left by ignorance. And that belief, in some cases, produced real psychological relief. What many still get wrong is the assumption that medieval people were simply ignorant or passive. In reality, they observed, experimented, and shared knowledge. They built hospitals, kept records, trained apprentices, and traveled long distances in search of treatment. They adapted when plagues struck. They questioned when treatments failed. The foundations of modern medicine, from hospitals to medical ethics, have roots in this misunderstood period. The mistake isn't just in underestimating their intelligence, it's in overlooking the conditions they faced. Without modern tools, without sterilization or anesthesia, without an understanding of infection, they used what they had. And what they had was a blend of inherited texts, local tradition, spiritual belief, and necessity. What this era reveals isn't just how far medicine has come, it's how human beings respond when they have no clear answers. Fear drives action. Belief fills the vacuum. Trial and error becomes a method, even if the science isn't yet there. Progress isn't always clean or linear. Sometimes it starts in the dark with questions, mistakes, and persistence. Medieval medicine wasn't a dead end. It was a long, painful beginning.